There's a stone still sitting near the ruins of ancient Corinth with a name carved into it in Latin. It reads, roughly translated, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid this pavement at his own expense. Aedile was a real civic office, something like a city commissioner. Whoever this man was, the city thought his name was worth carving into permanent stone. Here's what makes that stone matter. Several scholars connect this same Erastus to a name Paul mentions elsewhere, in Romans 16:23, calling him the treasurer of the city. That connection isn't universally agreed on, but if it holds, it means one of the only people with real civic standing in Corinth was also sitting in Paul's church, and Paul only had to name one. Stay with me on this, because it isn't really a story about ancient Corinth. It's a story about whether being overlooked has ever actually meant being missed. Corinth wasn't short on impressive people. It was a wealthy Roman port city rebuilt from ruins less than a century earlier, and by Paul's time, it had become a place where ambitious people went to climb. Officials, merchants, patrons who paid for public buildings just to see their names carved into them. Historians agree that in a city like this, a large share of the people living there were enslaved, with almost no path to anything Rome considered a name worth remembering. Status wasn't just admired in Corinth, it was something you could point to, literally, in stone. Erastus could point to his. Almost no one else in that church could. Because here's the line that makes him stand out so sharply. Paul writes, "For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. Not none, not many." Paul isn't describing a church with zero exceptions. He's describing a church where the exceptions were rare enough to name individually, while almost everyone else came from somewhere else entirely. Picture that room for a second. Dock workers unloading grain ships at dawn. Tent makers and leather workers running small stalls, the kind of trade Paul himself practiced. Freed slaves still carrying the legal restrictions of their old status even after gaining their freedom. These weren't the people Corinth wrote about on pavement stones. These were the people Corinth walked past without noticing. And if this kind of digging into scripture is your thing, this channel does it every week. Subscribe stays open while we keep going. Paul doesn't treat this as an embarrassing detail to explain away. He treats it as the strategy itself. God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. Twice in one sentence, he uses the word chosen. Not settled for, chosen. The next line goes further still. And base things of the world, and things which are despised hath God chosen to bring to naught things that are. Despised isn't a soft word. Paul is telling a room full of former slaves and manual laborers that the very reason they're sitting there is that the world had already written them off. Think about the last time you sent out a resume that never got a callback, or watched someone else's name get read out for something you'd quietly hoped was yours. Not insulted, just skipped. That feeling has a shape most people recognize instantly, even now, even here. So why would this be the strategy? Paul answers his own question a few lines later, that no flesh should glory in his presence. If God had recruited the philosophers first, the officials first, it would be easy, centuries later, to credit the movement's survival to impressive people getting behind it early. Instead, the story that survived is stranger. A movement built out of dock workers and freed slaves took root anyway, in one of the most status-driven cities in the empire. That's not a footnote in the story. That's the whole argument. And this pattern doesn't stop with Corinth. Fishermen became the core of Jesus' own inner circle. A despised tax collector ended up writing one of the Gospels. Even Paul lists his own impressive credentials in another letter he wrote to the church in Philippi, then calls all of it worthless next to what he'd found instead. So bring this back to the room you're sitting in right now, not Corinth's. Maybe you're closer to Erastus, some title, some level of success, and a quiet worry that it disqualifies you from something more honest. Or maybe you're closer to the majority in that church, the one whose name never made it onto anything, wondering if this was ever really written for someone like you. Paul's answer to both is the same. Neither status disqualifies you. Neither status earns you a place. Being skipped past by whatever ranks people today was never proof you'd been missed. Here's the part worth sitting with. If this church had been built by recruiting the most impressive people first, everyone else would spend their life feeling let in through a side door. Paul is describing the opposite. They were the point. That old pavement stone with Erastus's name is probably still sitting exactly where archaeologists found it. A rare, literal record of the one person in that church whose name the city bothered to carve into anything permanent. Not because he was the point, because he was the exception that proves who was. Everyone else who sat beside him left no stone, no inscription, nothing the ancient world thought worth recording. And yet their names are the ones this letter still carries. Not because Paul set out to record them, because the God he wrote about had already refused to forget them. If you've ever felt completely overlooked, passed by, not chosen, say so in the comments. I read them. Tomorrow, we keep moving through this letter into a verse where Paul makes an even bolder claim that the wisdom he does teach isn't absent. It's just invisible to anyone still measuring by Corinth's old scale. That's next.